The stale air in the auction house back room before a record sale clung to my clothes. A cloying mix of antique dust, polished wood, and the faint metallic tang of an old safe. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unyielding glare on the rows of artifacts laid out for final inspection. I wasn't interested in the Ming vases or the first edition folios. My gaze was fixed on a small, unassuming wooden box, its surface scarred by time and neglect. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a fragment of bone. It was no more than a phalanx, a finger bone really, but its story was etched into its very marrow. I picked it up, feeling the surprising weight of something so small. The curator, a nervous, balding man in an ill-fitting suit, hovered beside me, wringing his hands. "Remarkable preservation, wouldn't you say, Mr. Davies?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate relic. I ignored him, my thumb tracing the smooth, almost polished surface. This wasn't typical decay. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, a residue that hinted at a unique burial environment. The bone structure itself spoke of an individual no older than 25, the epiphyseal plates fully fused but still bearing the subtle marks of recent growth. A small fracture near the distal end, long since healed, told of a past trauma, perhaps a fall or a clumsy accident, sustained years before death. I could almost picture the hand it belonged to, the life it lived. This wasn't just a piece of history. It was a whisper of a person. My phone vibrated, an insistent buzz against my palm. I set the bone back in its box with deliberate care, already feeling the pull of something more urgent. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized. Detective Miller from the State Bureau. He wasn't one to call unless it was serious, or deeply, unusually strange. "Davies," I answered, stepping away from the curator's anxious gaze. "Seth, I need you." Miller's voice was clipped, devoid of his usual dry humor. "We've got a situation. Remote site, old research facility. He was found something atypical." My brow furrowed. "Atypical how, Miller?" "Perfectly preserved," he said, and the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Decades old by initial estimates. Not frozen, not mummified in any way we understand. Just there, like they went to sleep yesterday. My mind instantly pivoted from ancient relics to impossible forensics. Where is this facility? About 3 hours north of the city, off the old logging roads. Been abandoned since the late 70s. Locals call it the Labyrinth because of its layout. No one's been near it in decades, not really. Some kids broke in, found it. A perfectly preserved body from decades ago in an abandoned research facility. The words resonated with a strange, unsettling clarity. My determination, usually focused on the minute details of the past, now sharpened on an unfolding enigma. This was a challenge unlike any I'd faced. "Send me the coordinates," I said, already walking towards the back exit, leaving the hushed reverence of the auction house behind. The curator watched me go, his mouth slightly agape, the finger bone forgotten. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shedding its suburban sprawl for dense, encroaching forest. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to a barely discernible track carved through thick undergrowth. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The further I drove, the stronger the sense of isolation became, as if the world was actively trying to forget this place. My internal clock, usually so attuned to the rhythm of the city, recalibrated to the slow, deliberate pulse of the wilderness. Finally, the trees parted, revealing a sprawling skeletal structure silhouetted against the bruised afternoon sky. The abandoned research facility was a testament to decay. Windows were shattered eyesores, walls streaked with grime and mildew, and a collapsed section of the roof gaped like a wound. Overgrown vines snaked around support beams, reclaiming concrete and rusted metal. It was a place where ambition had died, leaving behind only echoes. A single patrol vehicle and Miller's unmarked sedan were parked haphazardly near what must have once been the main entrance. Miller, a tall, gaunt man with a perpetually tired expression, met me at the perimeter tape. His usual cynical smirk was absent, replaced by a grim line. "Thanks for coming, Seth," he said, his voice low. "You're not going to believe this." I nodded, pulling on my gloves, my gaze sweeping over the dilapidated building. It felt as though the very air held its breath. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay, a stark contrast to the promise of perfect preservation. Every step echoed, amplified by the emptiness, each sound a stark reminder of the building's abandonment. We navigated through collapsed ceilings and scattered debris, Miller leading the way with a powerful flashlight. He stopped outside a heavy steel door, its surface rusted and pitted, but surprisingly intact. A single padlock, ancient but still functional, had been cut away. This was sealed from the outside, Miller explained, shining his light on the severed shackle. Original lock, too. Whoever put it here didn't want it opened. He pushed the door inward. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a small, windowless room. The air within was strangely dry, almost unnaturally still. And then I saw it. Lying on a metal gurney, beneath a thin, transparent sheet of what looked like aged plastic, was the body. Not a skeleton, not a desiccated husk, but a person. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, her features soft, undisturbed. Her eyes were closed, her lips faintly parted, as if caught in a peaceful slumber. Even her clothes, a simple blouse and trousers, seemed to defy the decades. There was no visible decomposition, no insect activity, no telltale signs of the passage of time. The skin, though pale, retained its integrity, free from the usual discoloration of death. It was an impossible tableau, a frozen moment in time. I knelt beside the gurney, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a paradox, a fundamental challenge to everything I knew about death and decay. A profound tension settled in the pit of my stomach. A premonition that this perfectly preserved individual was merely the first unsettling chapter in a story far more sinister than any auction house could ever hold. Ichiccated corpse, but something else entirely. It was a person, remarkably intact, their features discernible even through the thin, almost crystalline film that encased them. My breath hitched. Before I could even process the full implications of what I was seeing, a hand gripped my shoulder. "Davies, we've got a situation," the lead detective stated, his voice a low rumble. Orders came down. The site's compromised. We had to move the specimen. My gaze snapped to him, then back to the body. Move it? To where? This is a primary scene, the integrity. I started, my voice tight with professional indignation. "No choice. Classified orders. It's secure for now." He gestured vaguely, pulling me back from the doorway. "Follow me." The abrupt shift was jarring. One moment I was in a sterile, silent room within what felt like an abandoned research facility, facing an impossible find. The distant murmur of voices and the rhythmic clatter of heavy objects grew steadily louder. The contrast was stark, almost absurd. Overhead, bare bulbs cast harsh pools of light on stacks of crated artwork, antique furniture draped in canvas, and rows of glass display cases awaiting their treasures. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with forgotten curiosities, chipped porcelain, tarnished silver, bound volumes with brittle pages. A loading dock door stood ajar at one end, letting in the cool, damp air of the late afternoon and the rumble of city traffic. The place vibrated with a nervous energy, the palpable anticipation of impending transactions. And there, amidst the controlled chaos, was the gurney. The body, still under its translucent shroud, lay incongruously in the center of a cleared space, surrounded by my field kit now hastily unpacked. A uniformed officer stood guard near the only exit, his eyes scanning the room with an almost theatrical vigilance. "This is less than ideal," I muttered, my voice barely audible above the rising hum of activity from the main auction hall. The lead detective simply nodded, his expression grim. "Make do. We don't have long. Sale starts in an hour, and this space needs to be clear." I wasted no time. Pulling on my gloves, I approached the gurney, my mind racing to reestablish my focus amidst the noise and the inappropriate setting. The plastic sheet wasn't plastic at all, not in the conventional sense. It was something else entirely. A thin, almost crystalline membrane that clung to the body's contours, preserving every detail. My fingers, even through the latex, could feel its unusual texture. Cool, rigid, yet flexible, like ancient cellophane. I knelt, peering closer. The face, though obscured by the film, was distinct. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with delicate features. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted. There was no decomposition, no decay. Her skin held a faint, waxy pallor, but the overall impression was one of suspended animation, not death. This wasn't merely preserved. It was arrested. My internal clock, calibrated by years of examining remains, screamed at me. This wasn't a body from a few years ago, or even a decade. The very material encasing her, the way it had aged, the subtle shift in tissue density I could perceive even through the film, this was far older. My initial estimate, a whisper in my own mind, was at least half a century, perhaps more. The implications were staggering. Who could have done this, and why? Carefully, I began my initial external assessment. The membrane made direct contact impossible, but I could still observe. I noted the clothing, a simple, almost utilitarian dress, its fabric faded but not decayed, clinging to her form. It looked like something from the mid-20th century. Then I saw it. A faint discoloration on the left side of her temple, visible even through the film. It wasn't a bruise of decomposition. It was a trauma, a blunt force impact, small but distinct. And lower, near her collarbone, a subtle distortion in the material suggested a sharp, penetrating wound, meticulously hidden by the folds of her garment. This wasn't a natural death, nor an accident. This was violence, carefully concealed. The meticulousness extended beyond the preservation. The way the body was laid out, almost reverently, on the gurney beneath its strange covering, spoke volumes. This wasn't a casual disposal. This was an intentional act of preservation and concealment, a deliberate attempt to erase a life and hide a crime. It hinted at a level of planning, resources, and, most disturbingly, a scientific understanding that went far beyond typical criminal activity. It wasn't just a body, it was a secret, meticulously guarded for decades. A shiver, unrelated to the cool air, traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a carefully orchestrated cover-up, decades in the making. And whoever was behind it was still active, still powerful, and clearly determined to keep their secrets buried. The thought settled heavily in my gut, a cold, hard knot of unease. My quest had just begun. The crystalline membrane yielded with a soft, almost imperceptible hiss as I peeled it back. It wasn't plastic, not in any conventional sense I knew. It felt like compressed air, a fragile yet impossibly resilient film that had held time at bay for decades. The scent, previously trapped, now seeped into the confined space around me, a faint, dry earthiness, devoid of decay. The discovery site had been deemed too exposed, too precarious for a thorough examination. So, under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, the body, still shrouded in its peculiar casing, had been carefully transported. Crates of antique furniture stood stacked against one wall, their polished surfaces reflecting the harsh glare of my portable examination lights. The air, usually thick with dust and the scent of aged wood, had been scrubbed clean, the concrete floor covered with sterile sheets. My gloves, thin and precise, skimmed the surface of the exposed skin. It was cool, almost waxy to the touch, but unnervingly supple, not desiccated or stiff. Her features, though aged by the passage of years, were remarkably intact, a serene, almost contemplative expression fixed upon her face. I began my meticulous external examination, circling the gurney, my eyes absorbing every detail. He was a woman, mid-40s perhaps, with fine, dark hair that had been pulled back, now slightly disheveled. Her clothing was simple, utilitarian. A faded, heavy-weave lab coat over a plain shirt and trousers, all fashions distinctly from the 1970s. The fabric, like her skin, showed no signs of degradation, only the wear of daily use. My gaze settled on her left hand. A plain silver ring, unadorned, sat on her ring finger. More importantly, tucked into a small zippered pocket on the sleeve of her lab coat, I found a laminated identification card. The plastic, surprisingly clear, bore a faded photograph of the woman before me, younger but unmistakably her. Beneath the photo, in crisp sans-serif font, read, Dr. Evelyn Reed, Project Coordinator, Advanced Biological Research. A logo, an abstract helix intertwined with a stylized A, was printed in the corner. Evelyn Reed. A brilliant, controversial scientist from the 1970s, known for her groundbreaking, often ethically questioned work in genetics and cellular regeneration. The connection to a remote research facility, abandoned for decades, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. With the identity confirmed, the internal examination became even more critical. I made the initial incision, the scalpel gliding through tissue that felt less like flesh and more like a perfectly sculpted polymer. My internal monologue wrestled with the implications of the preservation itself, but the deeper I delved, the more disturbing the discoveries became. Her skeletal structure, initially appearing normal, harbored subtle but profound alterations. Ribs, for instance, showed a peculiar density, almost crystalline in their matrix, particularly around the sternum. It wasn't bone disease or trauma, it was a structural enhancement, seamlessly integrated. I ran my gloved finger along a section of her ulna, feeling an unnatural smoothness. A subtle ridge that wasn't anatomical. It was as if certain bone segments had been replaced or reinforced with an unknown synthetic material, perfectly fused with her own biology. Then came the soft tissues. Her internal organs, while preserved, were not entirely pristine. I found what appeared to be tiny, thread-like filaments woven into the myocardial tissue of her heart, almost invisible without magnification. They weren't sutures from a surgical repair. They were too fine, too numerous, and too deeply integrated. These were advanced, non-consensual modifications, the kind of cellular-level engineering that bordered on the impossible for the era. The evidence pointed unmistakably to human experimentation. Someone had taken Evelyn Reed and transformed her, or attempted to. The implications were immense, stretching far beyond a simple murder investigation. I continued my work, my movements precise, my mind a storm of questions. The technician, quiet and efficient, handed me instruments as needed, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but I could feel the tension radiating from her, mirroring my own. The air in the back room, despite its sterile efforts, felt heavy, charged with the weight of this grotesque revelation. Evelyn Reed was not just a victim. He was a canvas for a terrifying vision, a silent scream from a forgotten past. And the architect of that vision, the individual or group responsible for these modifications, was still out there. The record sale, a distant echo of normal life, felt 1,000,000 miles away. I had unearthed not a corpse, but a warning. The faint, cloying sweetness of formaldehyde, a ghost from the abandoned facility, still clung to my clothes, a persistent whisper of the past. I hunched over a stack of brittle yellow documents, my fingers carefully turning each page, a delicate dance against the inevitable decay of time. I'd spent the last 3 days since the discovery sifting through every available public record, every obscure academic journal, and every historical society archive I could access remotely. The name Dr. Reed was a phantom, appearing in early 20th century scientific papers, then vanishing almost entirely after the late 1940s, only to resurface in cryptic, unsubstantiated rumors. My current lead had brought me here, to a collection of effects from a defunct historical society, rumored to contain personal papers of individuals connected to the region's forgotten industrial past. The abandoned facility, I was now convinced, wasn't just a forgotten structure. It was a deliberately erased one. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing a grimy window, illuminating the chaotic stacks of antique furniture, crated artworks, and boxes overflowing with forgotten lives. My gaze swept across faded photographs of stern-faced industrialists and their families, handwritten ledgers detailing forgotten transactions, and dry academic texts on obscure scientific principles. I was searching for an anomaly, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of historical normalcy. Then I found it. Tucked within a leather-bound journal, disguised as an inventory log for a textile factory, was a single loose sheet of paper. It wasn't the journal's original stock. The paper was thicker, the ink a more vibrant blue. The handwriting, though slightly spidery with age, was undeniably familiar from the few surviving Dr. Reed signatures I'd found. The text was sparse, almost coded. Project Chimera. Phase Gamma initiated. Subject integrity protocols under review. He was observed neural plasticity anomalies. Replication rate exceeding projections. Caution. Public dissemination risks unacceptable. My mind raced, connecting the fragmented pieces. Project Chimera. The name itself was a sinister blend of myth and science. Neural plasticity anomalies pointed directly to the brain, to the very essence of thought and control. Replication rate exceeding projections could mean anything from cellular regeneration to a frightening spread of influence. And public dissemination risks unacceptable confirmed the secrecy, the inherent danger of whatever this project entailed. This wasn't just about preserving a body. It was about preserving a terrifying secret. Mind control. Genetic manipulation. The possibilities twisted my gut. I carefully folded the paper, tucking it into my inner jacket pocket. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. This was more than a discovery. It was a direct confirmation of the darkest whispers I'd chased. Finding anything of interest, Professor Davies? The voice was smooth, cultured, and unsettlingly close. I hadn't heard anyone approach over the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of the crowd outside. I turned slowly, my investigative mask firmly in place. Standing a few feet away was an older individual, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, hair neatly combed back, a faint, knowing smile playing on their lips. They were the archivist, the overseer of these forgotten treasures, whose initial welcome had been polite but distant. Now their eyes held a sharpness I hadn't noticed before. Just some fascinating insights into local manufacturing history, I replied, keeping my tone even. The textile industry here was surprisingly robust. The archivist's smile widened, but it didn't reach their eyes. Indeed. Though sometimes, the most robust industries are those that operate entirely out of sight. This wasn't a casual observation. I suppose that depends on what one is looking for, I countered, my gaze unwavering. Like ancient artifacts. Once exposed to the air, they crumble. Once a secret is unearthed, it can shatter more than just reputations. Their eyes flickered to my jacket pocket, a movement so subtle I almost missed it. There are powerful forces, you see, that prefer certain narratives remain just that. Narratives. Not active, inconvenient truths. The veiled threat hung in the air, thick and palpable as the dust. It wasn't a direct warning, but the implication was clear. I was treading on dangerous ground, and I was being watched. The hairs on my arms prickled. This individual knew. They knew about Project Chimera. Sometimes, Professor, reconstructing a life inevitably disrupts a power structure, especially when that life was inconveniently concluded. They paused, letting the words sink in. The sale begins in an hour. I understood. I had found something, and they knew I had. My presence, my questions, had triggered a response. I was no longer just an investigator. I was a target. Perhaps I conceded, gathering my minimal notes, careful not to reveal the true prize. As I walked past them, I felt their gaze on my back, a tangible weight. The scent of formaldehyde, I realized, wasn't just on my clothes. It was seeping into my future. The dismissal was a thinly veiled threat, a confirmation that I had poked a hornet's nest. My presence, my questions, had triggered a response. The abandoned research facility now felt less like a crime scene and more like a tripwire I'd unwittingly stepped on. I left the facility, the chill in the air matching the one creeping up my spine. My next move had to be swift, discreet. Dr. Reed's name had surfaced in a preliminary search of local archives. A brief mention of a small collection of personal effects slated for an upcoming auction, part of a liquidated estate. It was a long shot, but sometimes the past held its secrets in plain sight, waiting for the right pair of eyes. The drive to the city was a blur of highway lights and internal strategizing. The air hummed with a nervous energy, a blend of hushed conversations, the rustle of catalog pages, and the clatter of handlers carefully positioning valuable lots. Antique furniture gleamed under the spotlights. Paintings in gilded frames leaned against walls, and display cases showcased glittering jewelry. The place reeked of old money and the promise of more. I had arranged for a private viewing of Lot 317, an unassuming, dark mahogany writing desk. The auction house manager, a man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose and a permanent furrow in his brow, had eyed my credentials with a mixture of suspicion and professional courtesy. Someone might appreciate the craftsmanship. He left me with a curt nod, retreating to supervise the movement of a particularly fragile porcelain vase. It was a beautiful piece, clearly well-loved and used. My fingers traced the grain of the wood, searching for any inconsistency, any sign that it was more than just a desk. I pulled out each drawer, examining the dovetail joints, running my fingers along the bottom and sides. Nothing. Just dust and the faint scent of old paper. But Reed was a meticulous man, a man of secrets. He wouldn't leave anything obvious. I knelt, scrutinizing the underside, the back panels. A slight discoloration, a faint line where the grain didn't quite match. I pulled a small, specialized penlight from my kit, its beam cutting through the dim light of the back room. There, a hair-thin seam, almost invisible to the naked eye, running vertically down the center of the panel. It was a false back, expertly crafted. My heart gave a little lurch. This was it. Near the bottom, tucked under a decorative molding, I found a tiny, almost imperceptible button. It depressed with a soft click, and a section of the panel swung inward, revealing a shallow, narrow compartment. This wasn't just a desk. It was a time capsule. I carefully extracted the journal first. Its pages were filled with Reed's precise, almost clinical handwriting. The early entries detailed Project Chimera, confirming my worst suspicions. He wrote of genetic sequencing, environmental stressors, and the optimization of human potential. Euphemisms for a grotesque violation of human dignity. Then came the names, not of the subjects, but of the orchestrators. The director, Reed wrote, insists on pushing the boundaries. Their financial backing is immense, their influence far-reaching. They believe humanity's evolution can be guided, shaped. A specific name followed, carefully underlined. Elias Thorne. The name resonated with an unsettling familiarity. Thorne, the name of the family that owned the land where the facility stood, the family that had suddenly, inexplicably, sold it off decades ago. the same family that had, more recently, made quiet inquiries about my own work. I flipped to the photograph. It was of a young child, perhaps 5 or 6, with wide, intelligent eyes and a shock of bright, almost unnatural red hair. The child's gaze, even in the faded print, held a remarkable intensity. My eyes were drawn to a faint, almost invisible birthmark just above the left eyebrow, a small, star-shaped cluster of moles. A jolt, sharp and visceral, shot through me. I knew that mark. I had seen it in old family albums, on the faded photographs of my great-aunt, who had vanished without a trace in the late 1960s. A story whispered in hushed tones during my childhood. A family tragedy that was never fully explained. The red hair, the eyes, it was uncanny. My great-aunt, Evelyn, vanished. My hands trembled, the journal and photograph feeling suddenly heavy, imbued with a terrible weight. Project Chimera. Elias Thorne. My great-aunt. The pieces slammed together with brutal force, shattering the last vestiges of my detachment. This was personal. Deeply, horrifyingly personal. The threat I'd felt earlier, the menace from the detective, now made terrifying sense. I wasn't just digging up the past, I was digging up my past. And someone very powerful, someone named Thorne, wanted it buried forever. I had indeed poked a hornet's nest, and I could feel the first angry stirrings of its inhabitants. I pulled my vehicle into the cavernous bay, the crunch of gravel under tires sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. The factory's exterior, a crumbling relic of forgotten industry, belied the meticulous, if unconventional, setup I'd established within. I walked over to the main console, eager to review the last batch of spectral analysis data from the preserved victim's tissues. The preliminary readings had shown some anomalies, unusual isotopes that didn't fit any known environmental profile from the era. I was convinced they were a key. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up the directory. But instead of the familiar folder structure, I was met with a blank screen. My stomach dropped. I tried again, navigating through the system, my heart now a dull thud against my ribs. Every folder related to the current case, the victim's digital scans, the chemical composition reports, my preliminary anthropological findings, was empty, corrupted, erased. A cold certainty settled over me. This wasn't a system glitch. This was targeted. Someone had breached my network, not to steal, but to obliterate. I checked the external drives, the backups. All wiped clean, overwritten with meaningless strings of code. The hours of painstaking work, the delicate digital reconstructions, the minute details I'd spent days cross-referencing, all gone. My jaw tightened, a tremor of pure frustration running through me. This wasn't just a relic of the past I was investigating. This was an active force, powerful enough to reach into my sanctuary and blind me. I spent the next few hours meticulously checking my physical evidence. The actual bones, the clothing fragments, the soil samples. Thankfully, those remained untouched, locked away in their sealed containers. But the digital infrastructure of my investigation had been crippled. It forced me to rethink my next move. The detective's warning wasn't just a dismissal. It was a deliberate move to isolate me, to cut off my resources. My thoughts turned to the lead I'd been cultivating, a name I'd unearthed from dusty archives. A former groundskeeper at the abandoned research facility, long retired, but potentially a witness to the early days of the project. I'd found a tentative address, an old phone number. Now, more than ever, I needed to speak with him. I drove across the city, the urban sprawl slowly giving way to a quieter, tree-lined suburb. I knocked, the sound echoing in the afternoon stillness. No answer. I tried again, waited. Nothing. A neighbor watering petunias next door offered a curt. He moved out last week. Said he was going to live with family, somewhere upstate. Left pretty suddenly. My mind raced. Suddenly? After decades in the same house? The timing felt too coincidental, too neat. I pressed the neighbor for details, but she shrugged, oblivious or feigning it. Another dead end, another thread severed. It was clear now, anyone I tried to reach, anyone who could shed light on the past, was being systematically removed from the board. The killer wasn't just burying the past, they were actively managing the present, ensuring no new information surfaced. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was a live operation, and I was in the crosshairs. My official channels were compromised, my data erased, my potential witnesses vanished. I had to work off book, outside the system. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. A cryptic note, slipped under my vehicle's wiper blade, confirmed my fears. In the background, partially obscured, was a child who bore an unsettling resemblance to a younger version of my own father. My family, my past, was entangled in this. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the photograph, tucking it deep into my pocket. This wasn't just about justice for a forgotten victim anymore. I knew of one place where secrets often exchanged hands, where the past was valued and sometimes, inadvertently, revealed. A place bustling with the discreet movement of wealth and history. Antique furniture, gleaming silver, and canvases of vibrant art were carefully arranged under the cool, sterile light of industrial lamps. My footsteps on the polished concrete floor felt heavy, out of place amidst the delicate porcelain and the hushed reverence for history. I moved through the labyrinthine corridors, past shelves laden with forgotten treasures, my eyes scanning for a particular lot number. I felt the prickle of scrutiny, the unsettling sense that I was being watched, not just by the staff, but by something more insidious. The threat wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a powerful, active force, and I was now moving through its territory, exposed and alone. My determination solidified, hardening into a resolve as unyielding as the concrete beneath my feet. I wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Dr. Reed's final cryptic note had led me here. The key is not in what they hid, but what they discarded to be found. Along with it, a faded photograph of a peculiar, almost ornate pocket watch. That watch I'd discovered through a frantic search of auction catalogs and estate sales was lot 47B. It wasn't the watch itself I needed, but what might be with it, or in it. The photograph I carried, the one linking my family, felt heavy in my pocket, a constant chilling reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just an academic pursuit anymore. It was a desperate hunt for answers that had festered for decades. A stout individual, a floor manager by the crispness of his waistcoat, bustled past, nearly knocking over a pile of framed prints. He glanced at me with an impatient frown, clearly seeing me as an obstruction. "Moving along, sir. We're almost ready for the next section." "Just examining lot 47B, I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. "Considering a bid." He grunted, already halfway down the aisle. The auctioneer's voice, amplified and distorted, boomed faintly, announcing lot 45. My time was running out. The pocket watch, exactly as depicted in Reed's photograph, rested on a velvet cushion. Its casing was intricately engraved, a swirling pattern that seemed almost like an abstract map. It wasn't ticking. I ran my thumb over the engravings, searching for a seam, a hidden compartment, anything. Then I noticed it, not on the watch itself, but beneath it. A small, almost invisible slip of paper, folded so tightly it seemed part of the velvet. It was barely the size of a postage stamp. My fingers, surprisingly nimble despite my mounting anxiety, carefully pried it free. Unfolding it revealed a series of faint, almost microscopic symbols. Not letters, not numbers, but a sequence of tiny, stylized glyphs. They were familiar, in a haunting way. I'd seen similar markings etched into the stone walls of the abandoned facility, dismissed then as mere architectural flourishes or the idle carvings of someone long dead. Now they screamed a different message. They were a code, a key. My mind raced, connecting the glyphs to the strange, segmented diagrams Reed had painstakingly drawn in his hidden journals. Diagrams I'd initially thought were anatomical studies. They weren't. They were representations of a process, a sequence. Each glyph on the paper corresponded to a stage, an input, an output. And as I mentally overlaid them, a horrifying realization began to dawn. The experiments weren't just about understanding human potential or resilience. They were about engineering it. About isolating specific traits, enhancing them, replicating them. The diagrams, the glyphs, they described a method for selective augmentation, a way to create specific desired outcomes in human subjects. And the perfectly preserved body I'd found? The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. The killer wasn't just burying a dark past. They were protecting a viable, potentially incredibly lucrative future. The project wasn't abandoned because it failed. It was perhaps moved, refined, or continued in secret. The experiments weren't unethical. They were profitable. And the killer's motive extended far beyond mere secrecy or personal revenge. It was about exploitation, about leveraging the results of this horrific research for power, influence, or wealth. I looked at the glyphs again, my gaze sharpening. One symbol, repeated at the end of the sequence, stood out. It was a stylized crest, a falcon grasping a serpent. I remembered seeing it, briefly, in an old architectural blueprint of the region, specifically on a dedication plaque for a public works project funded decades ago by a prominent industrialist. A man whose family still commanded immense respect and wielded significant influence. The industrialist's name wasn't explicitly stated, but his family's enduring public symbol was. A respected public figure. Someone whose reputation was beyond reproach, whose charitable foundations and philanthropic endeavors were lauded. Someone who had the resources to fund such a project, the influence to keep it hidden, and the ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened its continued existence or exposure. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The killer wasn't a rogue scientist or a deranged enthusiast. They were a titan, a pillar of society. The auctioneer's voice boomed. Lot 46, now going once, going twice. My hands tightened around the small slip of paper. Lot 47B would be next. This wasn't just about a forgotten victim anymore. The hunt had just escalated into a full-blown war. The auctioneer's voice, amplified and distorted, boomed faintly, announcing Lot 45. My time was running out. The pocket watch, exactly as depicted in Reed's photograph, lay nestled on black velvet. I flipped it open. The face was pristine, white enamel with Roman numerals, a small second hand ticking steadily. But it wasn't the ticking that caught my attention. My thumb pressed lightly, testing for a seam. Nothing obvious. I pulled out my penlight, its narrow beam illuminating the tiny space between the hinge and the outer shell. There it was. A hairline crack, expertly disguised, almost invisible to the naked eye. This wasn't just a watch, it was a locket, or perhaps something more. My heart began to thrum, not with fear, but with the cold thrill of discovery. This was it, the key. Looking for something, Seth? The voice, smooth as polished obsidian, cut through the muffled sounds of the auction. I straightened slowly, turning to face the orchestrator. He stood just a few feet away, framed by towering stacks of crates filled with forgotten heirlooms. He hadn't just found me, he'd been waiting. Just admiring the craftsmanship, I replied, holding the watch up, letting the light catch its deceptive gleam. Though I suspect its true value isn't on the face. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered to the watch in my hand. A collector's item, certainly. But some things are best left undiscovered. Like the truth about Project Chimera? I watched his expression for any flicker of recognition, any tell. There was a tightening around his jaw, a momentary hardening of his gaze, but his composure remained largely intact. This man was a master of control. The facility, the subjects, the forced isolation. the bodies, meticulously preserved, yet denied their identities. All for what? A twisted quest for longevity? I saw it then, a brief flash of something akin to pride in his eyes. Mankind's ultimate ambition. They were willing participants in their own way, sacrifices for the greater good. Willing? I scoffed, my voice tight with indignation. You manipulated them. You stripped them of their dignity, their lives. The one I found, the woman. She wasn't just a subject. He was a person, a mother, and she died alone, trapped in your brutal experiment. I pointed to the watch. This belonged to her, or to someone she loved. A family heirloom passed down, a final link to a life you tried to erase. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. A sentimental trinket. You left a trail, a forensic signature, the unique preservation technique, the specific type of sedative used, the meticulous but ultimately flawed attempts to erase identities. I saw the signs. I connected the dots. The funding, the shell corporations, the sudden disappearance of key researchers. And the biggest clue of all, the pattern of missing persons reports from that era, all with similar profiles, all leading back to the same geographic nexus as your abandoned facility. I held up the watch, my thumb finally finding the hidden catch. With a soft click, the back plate sprang open, revealing not gears, but a tiny folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. This was the reveal. And this, I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. This is the proof. A list of names, not just subjects, but families. And a name, scrawled at the bottom, linking them all. A name I now recognize from my own family archives. The words hung in the air, a final damning accusation. The orchestrator's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock momentarily displacing his arrogance. Impossible, he breathed, his voice a low growl. He lunged, a sudden burst of speed that belied his age. I reacted instinctively, twisting away, the watch still clutched in my hand. He was stronger than I anticipated, his grip like iron as he grabbed my arm. The faint sounds of the auction from the main hall seemed impossibly distant. He tried to wrench the watch from my grasp, his fingers digging into my wrist. I held on, my knuckles white. This wasn't just about the evidence anymore. It was about survival. He was desperate, cornered, and that made him incredibly dangerous. I saw the glint of something metallic in his other hand, a small, wickedly sharp blade. You should have left it buried, Seth, he snarled, his face contorted with rage. Some secrets are meant to stay dead. I ducked under his arm, using his momentum against him. Slammed my shoulder into his chest. He staggered back, momentarily losing his footing. It bought me a second, just enough time to dart between two tall display cases filled with porcelain dolls, their vacant stares following my movement. I needed to get this information out, to someone, anyone. The auctioneer's voice announced Lot 46. I darted between two tall display cases filled with porcelain dolls, their vacant stares following my movement. My pursuer, the orchestrator of decades of deception, recovered quickly. I heard the scrape of his expensive shoe soles on the polished concrete floor behind me, his heavy breathing a constant chilling reminder of his proximity. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and a faint, acrid tang I now associated with the hidden facility. I glanced over my shoulder, seeing his hand reach out, fingers splayed, just inches from my jacket. I ducked again, sliding beneath a long table laden with silver platters and tarnished candelabras. The clatter as I dislodged a stack of ornate dessert plates was deafening in the otherwise silent room. He roared, a guttural sound of frustration and rage, as the silver tumbled around him. It bought me another precious second. I scrambled out from under the table, my knees protesting, and saw a narrow gap between a wall of framed paintings and a towering velvet-draped mannequin. It was a gamble, a tight squeeze, but my only option. I squeezed through, scraping my side against the rough canvas, the mannequin's painted eyes seeming to watch me with an unsettling stillness. A new voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Stop! Police!" The assailant froze, his back to me, just as I emerged from the gap. I saw the detective, a familiar face from the initial investigation, standing at the main entrance to the back room, his weapon drawn and pointed. Beside him, another officer, equally armed, covered the space. My pursuer, cornered, slowly raised his hands. The fury in his eyes was still palpable, directed squarely at me, but the fight had drained from his posture. He knew it was over. "Don't move," the detective commanded, his voice steady. The other officer moved forward, swiftly closing the distance, and expertly secured the man. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the vast space. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my muscles trembling with the sudden release of adrenaline. "Seth, are you all right?" the detective asked, holstering his weapon as the other officer led the now restrained killer away. I walked towards it, my heart still thrumming. The ledgers were titled, in stark, precise handwriting, Project Chimera, Subject Log. I pulled one out, my hands shaking slightly. The photographs, even more damning, showed the faces of the victims, young and old, before and after their lives were irrevocably altered. My family wasn't just linked to this, they were in it. The evidence, once secured and meticulously documented, became a seismic shockwave. The public, initially disbelieving, was rocked by the revelations of Project Chimera. News channels ran endless segments. Newspapers dedicated entire front pages to the unfolding horror. The sheer audacity of the decades-long cover-up, the identities of the powerful individuals involved, and the horrific nature of the experiments ignited a firestorm of outrage. The image of the body I had examined, once a macabre curiosity, became the face of a profound injustice, a silent testament to human cruelty. I stayed for as long as I could, poring over the ledgers, cross-referencing names and dates with my own findings, driven by a grim determination to leave no stone unturned. The emotional toll, however, was immense. The faces in those photographs haunted my sleep. But it was the photograph of the young woman, the one who looked so much like my grandmother, that truly began to unravel me. Project Chimera wasn't just a historical atrocity. It was a wound in my own lineage, a secret scar on my personal history. I had always approached my work with a clinical detachment, a necessary shield against the grim realities I faced. But this was different. This wasn't just a victim. It was a ghost from my past, a question mark hanging over my identity. The killer was apprehended, the evidence secured, the truth exposed for the world to see. But for me, the resolution was only the beginning of a far more personal excavation. The fight for justice for the victims of Project Chimera would continue, but for Seth Davies, it had become a profound, deeply personal quest for understanding and closure. The ledgers were a physical weight, not just in my hands, but pressing down on my chest, on my very understanding of the world. Project Chimera, Subject Log. The stark, precise handwriting on the covers was a chilling counterpoint to the horrors documented within. Names, dates, procedures, a clinical record of unimaginable cruelty. My hands shook, not from cold, but from a profound internal tremor as I opened the first volume. The pages detailed lives reduced to data points, individuals stripped of their humanity, all in the name of some twisted scientific pursuit. I recognized one of the faces from the family album I'd found earlier. A distant relative, a name whispered in hushed tones years ago, now screaming from the pages of this grim history. The discovery at the abandoned facility had been immediate and overwhelming. I'd secured the ledgers and photographs, carefully documenting their position before making the call. Within hours, the facility was a hive of activity. Forensic teams swarming over every inch, sealing off the entrance, turning the quiet desolation into a bustling, grim evidence locker. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, had taken my initial statement, her gaze unwavering as I recounted the gruesome findings. The body, perfectly preserved, had been carefully removed. Another life finally given its due respect, even decades later. My testimony, meticulously prepared with the legal team, was set to be a cornerstone of the prosecution. I had spent countless hours poring over the ledgers, cross-referencing names, dates, and the cryptic procedural notes. Each entry was a punch to the gut, a confirmation of the deeply unethical practices that had transpired. The weight of it all was immense, but so was my determination. My focus had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, from mere investigation to a deeply personal quest for understanding. The ledgers hinted at connections, names that resonated with old family stories, hushed anecdotes about a wealthy, eccentric great-uncle who had mysteriously disappeared from public life around the same time Project Chimera was at its height. But the secrets of my family's involvement remained fragmented, elusive. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with dusty curios, antique furniture draped in white sheets, and crates filled with forgotten estates. I felt exposed, a raw nerve amidst the calm professionalism. The name had leaped out at me from the ledgers. A benefactor, a silent partner in Project Chimera with an address listed that was eerily close to a property once owned by my great-uncle. A colleague from the investigative team, a sharp-witted financial analyst, had arranged my access, navigating the security with a practiced ease. It wasn't listed in the catalog. A small, tarnished brass plaque was affixed to its lid. My breath hitched. The initials carved into the brass were familiar, heartbreakingly so. My great-uncle's. This wasn't just a collection of books. This was a direct, undeniable link. Reaching for the box, my fingers brushed against the cool metal latch. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid slowly, the old wood groaning softly in protest. The watch was engraved with the same initials, and on its back, a tiny, almost imperceptible symbol, a stylized chimera. The parchment, when unfolded, revealed a handwritten letter. The elegant, looping script was instantly recognizable from old family correspondence I'd seen. It was my great-uncle's hand. But there was more. A postscript, almost an afterthought, mentioned the family's continued support and the promise of a future legacy. My great-uncle hadn't merely been aware. He had been an architect, a financier, a willing participant. And the legacy he spoke of. Was it the very property where the abandoned facility stood? The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture far more complex and personal than I had ever imagined. The legal proceedings would expose the project, but this... The revelation was a heavy blow, a bitter pill to swallow, but it also fueled a renewed, fierce determination. The tension in the quiet back room was no longer just external. It resonated deep within me, a silent, personal battle about to rage. I stood beside a massive, crated antique desk, its dark mahogany gleam hinting at hidden drawers and forgotten secrets, much like the case that had consumed my life for months. Outside, I could hear the growing murmur of the crowd, a low thrum against the thick walls, waiting for the gavel to fall. They were architectural schematics, meticulously drafted, detailing a sprawling complex. The abandoned facility. The truth, stark and undeniable, was laid bare in the precise lines and annotations. This was it. The property, the very ground where those lives had been extinguished and preserved, was now being liquidated. Not just the land, but the conceptual bones of the project itself. My great-uncle, the esteemed philanthropist, hadn't just dabbled. He had designed the very cage. His signature, a florid, confident flourish, was emblazoned on the bottom right corner of each drawing. The weight of that discovery pressed down on me, heavy and cold. The legacy he'd spoken of, the one he claimed was his family's burden and triumph, was this: a monument to unethical ambition, now to be sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder. A final cynical act of erasure, or perhaps a desperate attempt to sever all ties. I ran a thumb over the rough edge of one of the blueprints. Each line represented a decision, each room a space where human dignity was systematically dismantled. My work, my meticulous reconstruction of their lost identities, was the only voice they had left. It was a sobering thought, yet it fueled a quiet determination within me. Their stories, once buried beneath layers of earth and deception, had emerged, vibrant and demanding, through the silent language of bone and artifact. The initial shock of my great-uncle's deep involvement had given way to a profound sense of betrayal, followed by a steely resolve. The anger was still a simmering ember, but it was now channeled into purpose. I understood, with an agonizing clarity, that the legacy wasn't just a property or a project. It was a mindset, a corrosive belief that some lives were expendable for the sake of progress. And that mindset, I knew, was far harder to dismantle than any building. A colleague, the lead investigator on the criminal side, approached me, his face grim. "They're about to start the section with the estate documents," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the distant hum of the crowd. "The ones detailing the original land acquisition and funding. Your great-uncle's name is all over them." I nodded, my jaw tight. The final public accounting. The auction wasn't just selling off assets. It was selling off the last vestiges of a carefully constructed deception. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of genuine excitement for the valuable lots and an underlying current of unease. Perhaps stemming from the unspoken knowledge of what these items truly represented. "We have everything we need," I told him, my voice steady. The forensic evidence, the identities of the victims, the meticulous records of their torment. And now, the irrefutable paper trail leading directly to the architects of that horror. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "It's a good thing, Seth. Hard won." Hard won, indeed. The journey had been fraught with peril, with moments where I felt the very fabric of my understanding of family, of justice, tearing apart. There had been threats, veiled and direct, from those still determined to keep the past buried. But the voices of the dead, the silent narratives etched into their remains, had propelled me forward. Each shattered bone, each preserved tissue sample, each fragment of clothing had been a testament, a piece of a larger mosaic crying out for recognition. I thought of the young woman, her face perfectly preserved, her story finally told. Of the others, whose names I had meticulously pieced together from forgotten records and faded photographs. They were no longer nameless victims. They were individuals, their lives restored, however tragically, through the careful work of science. This was the enduring importance of forensic anthropology. To speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves, to hold power accountable, even decades later. The distant tap of a gavel echoed through the back room, signaling the start of the sale. The property, the legacy, would soon be dispersed, its tangible elements absorbed into new hands. But the truth, once unearthed, could not be so easily bought and sold. It would persist, a stark warning etched into the historical record. Closure, I realized, wasn't a neat, clean package. It was more like the slow, deliberate work of reconstruction itself. Painstaking, often painful, and never truly finished. They remained, subtle currents beneath the surface, reminding us of the fragility of justice and the enduring power of truth. I would continue to listen, to observe, to give voice to the unspoken, because the dead, even decades later, still had so much to tell us. The gavel fell again, sharper this time, and I turned, ready to face whatever came next. The investigation was over, but the vigilance, I understood, would never end.